So for me, the idea of illustrating this project as a former coastal student who was a senior when the pandemic struck was very, very interesting to me. I loved the idea of being able to read and focus on the stories of other students within reading about how these individuals learned to deal with and make their way through the pandemic, how the pandemic changed education, how the pandemic changed their everyday life, how it forced everyone into states of isolation. One of the things that I was really keen to do while I was respecting and embedding these students' stories into the illustrative work was consider and revise and revisit my own experience through the work as well. It's interesting now when I look back at the project since it's done, I am very, very keenly aware of the fact that making this work was very cathartic for me. I feel as though there were a lot of things that I still hadn't necessarily dealt with in my own experience as an undergrad student first, and the pandemic, and then even moving on to becoming a graduate student because I'm psychotic and went to grad school right after undergrad. That really came up through the act of making my inkings, and then ultimately the different versions of the illustrative work that were color tests. So that was very gratifying. And besides that, I just feel honored to be a vehicle for the stories of the students who are covered in this work. I also had the pleasure of illustrating portraits for each of these students, which was a really fun process of not only being given reference photos at first to work with from Abby, but then afterwards working with each of the students individually to see if there were any things about their portraits that they wanted changed, if they wanted new portraits for me to create portraits from. So getting them involved in the process, and then afterwards, getting their final consent saying, I am in love with my portrait, thank you so much for making it, was really, 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 really awesome. So when I was considering the narrative structure of this illustration, something that became very obvious to me as I was meeting with Easton and Abby and Sarah was how powerful this illustration could be if it was split up into 3 specific panels. Within those panels, it became a very, very vital thing for me to consider how the pandemic has progressed through time, positively or negatively impacting students at Coastal. So there are actually 3 specific panels that exist throughout this illustration. The first panel would be the actual cover of the magazine. That actually represents when the pandemic was starting. The second panel and the third panel are merged. They actually exist on the spread in which the story is introduced. To break down what each of those mean, essentially, if you look at the front of the magazine, there's a lot of imagery that speaks to themes of isolation, health hazards, time passing, technology. This image represents the start of the chaos. When around spring break 2020, I believe it was, the actual isolations were put in place and nobody knew what was happening as spring break was extended a second week. Graduations, important on-campus events that seniors had been looking forward to forever, etc., were moved and canceled in an attempt to keep people healthy. Moving to the spread, if you look at the first part, aka the page on the left, the first thing that you need to notice is that actually bleeds onto the cover, okay? This part of my illustration represents the endurance part of the pandemic, when everybody was adjusting to the, air quotes, new normal that life became as a result of COVID-19. Within that specific part of the panel, there is a lot of imagery of people socializing at socially distanced distances from each other. There are images of people in classrooms where teachers are both teaching in person to socially distanced students, but also to people online. Eventually, what you will see as you move towards the last part of the composition is a time when health precautions helped us navigate the newness of COVID-19, but life was becoming a little bit more normal for a great amount of people. Of course, within this imagery, you have to understand the fact that the pandemic is not over. It's not to say that it did not detrimentally impact people, but there was a sense of returning to things that people, because we value community and socialization, were able to come back to certain degrees. So as a creative person, I see myself as a jack of all trades. I consider myself to be a visual communicator. That is the term that I am most comfortable with in terms of a label for myself as a visual person, because I identify as a designer, an artist, and an illustrator based on not only my creative education, but also the kinds of creativity that I am interested in. My work discusses how I see, synthesize, and digest the world around me. It also discusses how the world consumes me in contrast. So this was the perfect project for me because it helped me visit and consider those themes that I discussed earlier, which are communication, consciousness, and companionship, in regard to a topic that is extremely sensitive and pertinent to me. Something that I was realizing as I was making this work was that not everybody that knew that I was making this work actually was aware of the fact that I was a student at Coastal in my senior year when the pandemic started. I remember very keenly when spring break of 2020 started. I remember when it was extended a week, and then I remember during that week how all of our classes were pushed online. Our wonderful professors were scrambling to figure out how to care for themselves, their families, their students, and ultimately the world descended into chaos. Now, of course, a health crisis in general is scary, not only for myself, family, friends, people around me, but amidst the scary health-related things that were happening in the world, I witnessed normal life as I knew it absolutely crumble. My senior shows that I had been looking forward to for 4 years as an undergrad student were canceled as a result of the fact that everybody needed to remain in isolation while COVID-19 was navigated. I wasn't allowed to leave the house. The only methods through which I could communicate with friends, family members, instructors, and other people was through technology. I can remember very well how much that impacted me. I also remember leaning towards an attitude of gratitude, which sounds extremely cheesy, but as a senior that was in my final semester of undergrad, I was incredibly grateful that that was the only semester of my undergrad experience that was detrimentally impacted by the pandemic. Now, I did go straight to grad school after I graduated from Coastal. That's a whole other can of worms, but one of the things that I feel like this specific illustration project brought me was a lot of empathy, not only for myself as somebody that was forced to navigate academia in life in the pandemic, but also for the students that came after me, for my fellow grad students that were having to wrestle with the same things. I don't think that we tell ourselves enough how strong we are for being able to endure that as young people, and for also coming out on the other side, because 2020 was a combination of extremely unprecedented events, and the fact that we were able to get through those times to any certain degree is incredibly, incredibly powerful.